The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the rows of cubicles. I sat hunched over my desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheet in front of me. Numbers blurred together as my mind wandered to places it shouldn't, places I had trained myself not to go during work hours. But today, they crept back uninvited, like shadows stretching long under the late afternoon sun. That IT wasn't that I hated my job. It was just comfortable, predictable, safe. The kind of safe where you could convince yourself you were happy because everything fit neatly into boxes. 9 to 5 routine, monthly paychecks, polite small talk with coworkers who didn't pry too deep. And then there was him, my boss, Daniel. He wasn't supposed to be part of those wandering thoughts. Not like this. Daniel was the epitome of straight-laced professionalism. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that made people trust him instantly. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his suits tailored to perfection. Everything about him screamed in control. It was infuriating and intoxicating all at once. We'd worked together for 3 years now, and until recently, I'd managed to keep our interactions strictly professional. Or so I thought. That changed last week when he stopped by my desk after hours. Everyone else had already left, leaving us alone in the quiet hum of the office. I looked up from packing my bag, startled by his presence. "Hey," he said casually, leaning one arm against the partition of my cubicle. "Got a minute?" I nodded, trying not to notice how his tie hung slightly loose around his collar or how his sleeves were rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms. "Sure. What's up?" He hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly as if debating whether to speak at all. Finally, he said, "I've been curious about something." "Curious? About what?" My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Okay, it's personal," he added quickly, almost defensively. Then softer, but also maybe not entirely unrelated to work. Now I was intrigued and nervous. Daniel wasn't the type to bring anything remotely personal into the office. Whatever this was, it mattered to him, enough to break his own rules. "What is it?" I asked carefully, closing the distance between us by leaning forward slightly, that he glanced around the empty office before meeting my gaze again. There was something raw in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Vulnerability? No, that wasn't Daniel. At least, not the Daniel I knew. "I heard through the grapevine," he began slowly, "that you're involved in the LGBTQ community outside of work." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what I'd expected. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. "Why do you ask?" He shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence faltering. "Igus I'm just curious about what it's like, being out, living openly." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a man like Daniel, a man whose life seemed so meticulously curated, it felt like a crack in the facade, a glimpse of something real beneath the polished surface. "You mean being gay?" I clarified. Though we both knew exactly what he meant, he nodded, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "Yeah, that." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Was this some sort of test? A way to gauge how much I trusted him? Or was he genuinely interested? Either way, I decided to tread lightly. "It's complicated," I said finally. "There are good days and bad ones. Days when it feels freeing, and others when it feels like you're carrying this weight no one else can see. But mostly it's just life. You learn to navigate it." He listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it." And just like that, he straightened up, gave me a brief nod, and walked away, leaving me more confused than ever. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior shifted subtly. He started lingering near my desk more often, asking questions that skirted the edges of appropriateness without crossing any lines. At first, I chalked it up to curiosity. After all, he'd admitted as much, but soon, I began to notice other things. The way his hand brushed mine when he handed me a file. The way his laughter lingered just a second longer than necessary during casual conversations. The way his eyes followed me across the room, even when he thought I wasn't looking. That IT was maddening and thrilling and completely terrifying. Point one evening, after most of the team had gone home, I found myself staying late to finish a project. The office was eerily silent except for the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard. Just as I was about to call it quits, Daniel appeared in the doorway of my cubicle, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering me one of the cups with a sheepish grin that I accepted it gratefully, surprised by the warmth radiating from the paper cup and from him. "Thanks. Didn't think anyone else was still here." "Just wrapping up some things," he replied, settling into the chair beside my desk. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" I shrugged, feigning nonchalance despite the butterflies rioting in my stomach. "Sure. Why not?" For the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing. Work, movies, music. Slowly, inevitably, the conversation drifted back to where it always seemed to lead these days, me. My life. While I was outside these walls at a T1 point, Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you ever feel like you're living 2 different lives? Like there's the person everyone sees, and then there's the real you hidden underneath?" His question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it mirrored my own thoughts so closely. All the time, I admitted quietly. Sometimes it feels like I'm performing, Like I have to put on this mask to make people comfortable. He nodded, his gaze steady and piercing. "I get that. More than you'd think." Before I could respond, he stood abruptly, brushing imaginary lint off his slacks. "Anyway, I should probably head out. Thanks for letting me crash your solo work session." As he turned to leave, I called after him impulsively. "Hey, Daniel." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Yeah? Why are you really asking me all this stuff?" His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but instead he simply smiled, a soft, enigmatic curve of his mouth, and walked away. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my mind, I realized something unsettling yet undeniable. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't over. In fact, it might only be beginning. Little did I know, those quiet moments in the office would unravel into something far more intense and far more dangerous than either of us could have imagined. But for now, uncertainty hung thick in the air, charged with possibility and longing. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, hoping to avoid any further encounters with Daniel. My mind was still tangled from our conversation the night before, and I wasn't ready to face him again. Not yet. But as fate would have it, he was already there when I stepped off the elevator, standing by the coffee machine in the break room. His tie was perfectly knotted today, his suit crisp and immaculate, but there was something different about him, a subtle tension in the way he held himself, like he was bracing for impact. "Morning," he said as I entered, his voice steady, but tinged with an edge I couldn't quite place. That I nodded, grabbing a mug from the counter. "Morning." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the coffee maker filled the silence between us, punctuated only by the occasional clink of porcelain against metal. It felt strange, unnatural, to share this quiet space with him after everything that had transpired. And yet, it also felt intimate, like we were suspended in some liminal bubble where the rest of the world didn't exist. Finally, he broke the silence. "Listen, about last night, my stomach flipped." "Yeah." He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the handle of his mug. "I don't want you to think I'm prying or overstepping. I just needed to ask those questions. For myself." His words caught me off guard. There was no pretense in his tone, no attempt to mask what he was saying behind layers of professionalism. This was raw, unfiltered Daniel, and it made my chest tighten in ways I didn't fully understand. "I get it," I replied carefully, though I wasn't sure I did. "Not really. But why now? Why me?" He looked away, his jaw working as if he were wrestling with how much to reveal. When he finally met my gaze again, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Because you're honest. About who you are." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "I guess I'm trying to figure out if I can be too." The air seemed to still around us, heavy with unspoken implications. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat echoing louder than the last. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? Or was I reading too much into his words, projecting my own desires onto him? Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching snapped us both back to reality. We exchanged a quick glance, his guarded, mine uncertain, and then went our separate ways, retreating into the safety of routine. That afternoon, I found myself replaying the conversation over and over in my head. What did it mean? Was Daniel questioning his sexuality? Or was he simply curious, driven by some abstract fascination with a life he didn't fully understand? Either way, it left me unsettled, and more than a little intrigued that it wasn't until later that week, during a company retreat, that things took an unexpected turn. The event was held at a sprawling resort nestled deep in the mountains, its glass walls offering panoramic views of snow-capped peaks and dense evergreen forests. While most of my coworkers spent their free time skiing or lounging by the indoor pool, I opted for a solitary hike along one of the marked trails, seeking solace in the crisp mountain air. About halfway up the path, I heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind me. Turning, I saw Daniel approaching, his breath visible in puffs of white vapor as he caught up to me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his cheeks flushed from the cold that I shrugged, trying to hide my surprise and the flutter of anticipation that stirred in my chest. "Sure. Knock yourself out." We walked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the rhythmic crunch of our boots and the distant rustle of pine needles swaying in the breeze. The trail wound upward through the trees, sunlight filtering through the branches in golden shafts that danced across the ground. It was peaceful here, removed from the chaos of the office and the weight of expectations. After a few minutes, Daniel spoke. "You come out here often?" "Not really," I admitted. "Just needed some space, you know? Clear my head." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, me too." Something in his tone made me glance at him sideways. "You okay?" He hesitated, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "Honestly? No, not really." The admission startled me. Daniel was always so composed, so self-assured. Seeing him falter, even slightly, was jarring. "What's going on?" I asked gently, that he sighed, kicking at a loose stone on the path. "It's stupid. You'll probably think I'm crazy. Try me." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a rush of words, he blurted out, "I kissed someone last weekend." My breath hitched. "Okay." And it wasn't my wife. The confession hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to process what he'd just said. Daniel was married. To a woman. A fact I'd known since the day I met him. And now, here he was telling me, of all people, that he'd crossed a line he'd likely spent years convincing himself he'd never even consider crossing. Who was it? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, avoiding my gaze. "Doesn't matter. What matters is it happened, and it scared the hell out of me." I stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Why are you telling me this?" His eyes met mine, searching for something, understanding, maybe, or absolution. "Because I trust you, and because I don't know who else to talk to." There it was again, that unguarded honesty that made him seem so achingly human, so unlike the polished executive everyone else saw. In that moment, I realized how lonely he must feel, carrying this secret inside him with no one to share it with. "Do you regret it?" I asked softly, but he looked away, his jaw tightening. "No, that's the problem." The weight of his words settled over us like a heavy blanket, suffocating and undeniable. Whatever this thing was between us, this fragile, tenuous connection, it had shifted irrevocably. There was no going back now that as we continued up the trail, the conversation turned lighter, though the tension lingered beneath the surface. We talked about work, about hobbies, about anything that might distract us from the elephant in the room. By the time we reached the summit, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The view was breathtaking, but it was the man standing beside me who truly stole my breath away. "You know," Daniel said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "I used to think I had everything figured out. My career, my marriage, my life. But lately," he paused, swallowing hard. "Lately, I'm not so sure anymore." I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that he'd find his way eventually. But I couldn't make promises I wasn't sure I believed myself. Instead, I simply stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, offering what little comfort I could without words. When we finally descended back to the resort, The mood had shifted once more. There was a new understanding between us, fragile and tentative but undeniably real. As we parted ways at the entrance, Daniel hesitated, his hand brushing mine briefly before pulling away. "Thanks for listening," he murmured, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I needed that. And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of colleagues milling about the lobby. But his touch lingered on my skin, a phantom reminder of the bond we'd forged in the solitude of the mountains. Back in my room that night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every fleeting moment of connection. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't going away anytime soon. If anything, it was growing stronger, weaving itself deeper into the fabric of my thoughts and emotions. And as terrifying as it was, I couldn't help but wonder, where would it lead? The days following the retreat felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with Daniel was charged, each glance and word layered with unspoken meaning. Yet amidst the tension, there were moments that felt disarmingly ordinary, like when he stopped by my desk to ask about a project or cracked a joke during a team meeting. Those fleeting glimpses of normalcy only made the weight of what we weren't saying even heavier. It wasn't until Friday evening, as I was packing up to leave, that things shifted again. The office had emptied out earlier than usual, leaving an eerie quiet behind. Just as I slipped my laptop into its bag, I heard his voice from the doorway. "Got plans tonight?" Daniel asked, leaning casually against the frame. I looked up, surprised. "Not really." "Why?" He shrugged, though there was something deliberate in the way he held himself. "Thought maybe you'd want to grab dinner." My treat. Dinner? With Daniel? My pulse quickened at the thought, but I forced myself to play it cool. "Sure. Why not?" His lips curved into a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but still managed to send a jolt through me. "Great. Let's go." We ended up at a cozy Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street, far enough from the office to feel safe yet intimate. The air smelled faintly of garlic and fresh basil, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. We slid into a booth near the back, where the lighting was dim and the atmosphere inviting. As we poured over the menu, Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "So," he began, his tone light but tinged with curiosity, "what's your favorite dish here?" "I don't know," I admitted, flipping through the pages. "Never been here before." His eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "You've never been to Tony's? What kind of foodie are you?" I laughed, feeling some of the tension ease between us. "Apparently not a very good one." "Well, we'll have to fix that." He signaled for the waiter, ordering 2 glasses of red wine and insisting on choosing dishes for both of us. Watching him take charge was oddly endearing. It reminded me of how effortlessly confident he could be outside the confines of the office. When the food arrived, a rich lasagna for him and a creamy mushroom risotto for me, we dug in without hesitation. The flavors exploded on my tongue, earthy and decadent, and I couldn't help but groan softly in appreciation. Daniel chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "Good, huh?" "Incredible," I replied, taking another bite. "You've got good taste." Something flickered in his eyes at my words, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Glad you approve." As the meal progressed, our conversation flowed more easily than I expected. We talked about everything: our favorite books, childhood memories, even embarrassing moments from high school. There was a lightness to the exchange, a playful banter that made me forget, if only for a moment, the complexities lurking beneath the surface. But then, inevitably, the mood shifted. Daniel set down his fork, his expression turning serious. "Can I ask you something?" My stomach tightened. "Of course." "What's it like being with someone who understands you completely? Someone who gets all of it? The good, the bad, the messy parts?" The question caught me off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. It was clear now that this dinner wasn't just about food or casual conversation. This was Daniel grappling with his own fears, his own desires, using me as a mirror to reflect what he wanted but couldn't fully articulate. I hesitated, searching for the right words. It's freeing. Scary sometimes, because you're letting someone see you at your most vulnerable. But also beautiful, like coming home after a long journey. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. Sounds nice. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken longing and uncertainty. Finally, he broke it with a soft laugh. Sorry, didn't mean to get so heavy. It's okay, I assured him, reaching across the table to brush my fingers lightly against his wrist. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver down my spine. His skin was warm beneath mine, and for a split second, I wondered what it would feel like to hold his hand, to let myself lean into the connection simmering just below the surface. Instead, I pulled away, clearing my throat. You can talk to me anytime. You know that, right? His smile returned, softer this time, tinged with gratitude. Yeah, thanks. Later that night, as we walked back to our cars, the city streets were alive with energy. Neon lights reflected off puddles left by an earlier rainstorm, and the air carried the faint scent of damp pavement and car exhaust. Despite the urban chaos around us, the space between Daniel and me felt insulated, private. You know, he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I used to think happiness was this big, flashy thing. A promotion, a new house, stuff like that. But lately, he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Lately, I'm starting to realize it's the little things. Like tonight, good food, good company. That's enough. His words resonated deeply, striking a chord within me. Yeah, I agreed quietly. Sometimes the simplest moments are the ones that stick with you. We reached my car first, and I turned to face him, unsure of how to say goodbye. The night had been unexpectedly perfect, filled with laughter and vulnerability and moments that felt achingly real. And yet it ended here, with the two of us standing under a flickering street lamp, the world pressing in around us. Thanks for tonight, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It meant a lot. He stepped closer, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, or at least try, but instead he simply smiled. Anytime. And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering warmth of his presence. Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Late-night texts became a regular occurrence, often starting innocently enough, but spiraling into hours-long conversations about life, love, and everything in between. During work hours, we found excuses to collaborate on projects, stealing glances across the room when no one was looking. Each stolen moment felt like a secret shared between us, binding us closer together. One evening, Daniel invited me to his apartment under the guise of reviewing a presentation. When I arrived, however, I found him barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and flour dusting his hands. Making dinner? I teased, setting my bag down on the counter. He grinned sheepishly. Trying to. Thought I'd return the favor after Tony's. The sight of him like this, domestic, approachable, was disarmingly charming. As he moved around the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. It was intoxicating, watching him lose himself in something so simple yet meaningful. At a T1 point, as he handed me a glass of water, our fingers brushed longer than necessary. Neither of us pulled away immediately, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. His gaze locked onto mine, dark and intense, and I felt the pull between us like a physical force. You should probably let go, I murmured, though I didn't move. Probably, he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. But he didn't release my hand. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating off his body. My breath hitched, anticipation coiling low in my stomach. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and craving in equal measure. But then, as if snapping out of a trance, he took a step back, releasing my hand and running a frustrated hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I shouldn't. It's okay, I interrupted, though my heart was pounding wildly. We don't have to rush anything. He exhaled sharply, nodding. Right? Yeah, dinner first. We finished cooking in relative silence, the tension between us palpable but unspoken. When we finally sat down to eat, the meal was delicious, but it was overshadowed by the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between us. Afterward, as we cleaned up together, Daniel paused, leaning against the sink. Do you ever feel like we're playing with fire? All the time, I admitted, meeting his gaze. But sometimes, isn't that worth it? He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't going to burn out anytime soon. It was a Friday night, and the city buzzed with restless energy. Rain drizzled against the windows of Daniel's apartment, casting rippling shadows across the dimly lit room. We had fallen into a rhythm over the past few weeks. Dinners, late-night conversations, stolen glances at work. But tonight felt different. The air between us was electric, charged with an unspoken understanding that something was about to shift, that we were sitting on his couch, ostensibly watching a movie, but neither of us was paying much attention. The screen flickered in the background, its muted colors reflecting off the rain-speckled glass. Instead, our focus was entirely on each other, the space between us shrinking incrementally as the hours passed. You know, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the quiet hum of the film, I've been thinking. About what? I asked, my voice softer than intended, betraying the nervous flutter in my chest that he hesitated, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his wine glass. About us. About this. He gestured vaguely between us, as if words failed him, that my heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment we'd both been circling around for weeks. And yet, part of me wanted to pull back, to retreat into the safety of ambiguity rather than face whatever lay ahead. What about it? I prompted cautiously, though I already knew the answer. Daniel set the glass down on the coffee table, turning to face me fully. His expression was raw, stripped of the polished veneer he usually wore like armor. I can't keep pretending this is just casual, that I don't feel something deeper here. The honesty in his voice hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. For all his confidence, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my chest ache. This wasn't the composed executive who commanded boardrooms, or the guarded man who hid behind layers of professionalism. This was someone else entirely, someone fragile, uncertain, and achingly human. I don't want you to pretend, I admitted quietly, my gaze dropping to my hands. But I also don't want to push you into something you're not ready for. His hand reached out, covering mine before I could withdraw it. The contact sent a jolt through me, grounding me in the present. You're not pushing me, he said firmly. If anything, you're holding me back from running head first into this. I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes now, only determination and fear. Fear of rejection, of judgment, of losing control. But beneath it all, there was desire, a hunger that mirrored my own. Before I could respond, he leaned closer, his free hand brushing against my cheek. My breath hitched as his thumb grazed my skin, sending shivers down my spine. His touch was tentative, almost reverent, as if he were afraid I might disappear if he pressed too hard. Tell me to stop, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. And I will. But I didn't want him to stop. Not now. Not when every fiber of my being yearned for this connection, for the release of tension that had been building between us for so long. Instead, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters. Then slowly it deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. His fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, while mine clutched at the fabric of his shirt, anchoring myself to him. Time seemed to dissolve around us, leaving only the sound of rain tapping against the window and the rhythm of our breathing. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for air, the world felt sharper, brighter, as if the haze of uncertainty had lifted. Daniel rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breath warm against my skin. That wasn't supposed to happen, he murmured, though there was no regret in his tone. It did, I replied simply, my voice barely above a whisper. And it changes everything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air, undeniable and irreversible. Whatever boundaries we'd maintained until now had crumbled, leaving us exposed and vulnerable in ways neither of us could have anticipated. Finally, Daniel opened his eyes, his gaze searching mine. What do we do now? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. This wasn't just about us. It was about the lives we'd built, the people we'd become. For him, it meant confronting a marriage he'd once believed was unshakable. For me, it meant risking my heart on someone who might not be ready to give theirs fully in return. We take it one step at a time, I said finally, choosing my words carefully. No rushing, no pressure, just honesty. Between us. He nodded, though I could see the conflict warring within him. Okay, one step at a time. Later that night, after the rain had slowed to a gentle patter, we found ourselves lying side by side on his bed, still clothed but impossibly close. His arm was draped loosely over my waist, his breathing steady and even. In the faint glow of the bedside lamp, I studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the faint stubble shadowing his chin. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, his voice drowsy but tinged with curiosity. That I smiled, tracing idle patterns on his forearm. "That I never thought I'd end up here. With you." He chuckled, the sound low and rumbling in his chest. "Me neither. But I'm glad I did." His words filled me with a warmth that spread from my chest to the tips of my fingers and toes. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. That we could navigate the complexities of our lives together. One fragile step at a time, that as sleep began to claim us. Daniel tightened his hold on me slightly, pulling me closer. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "For letting me be honest. For letting me feel." "You don't have to thank me," I whispered back, closing my eyes. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. That you'll keep being honest. With me. With yourself." He was silent for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far. But then, softly, he replied, "I promise." And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet intimacy of the night, I believed him. The morning after was quiet, almost too quiet. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long golden stripes across Daniel's bedroom floor. I lay there for a while, listening to the sound of his steady breathing beside me, trying to reconcile the man sleeping peacefully with the whirlwind of emotions that churned inside me. Last night had been everything I'd wanted and more. Tender, passionate, real. But now, in the cold light of day, reality began to creep in. Daniel stirred eventually, his eyes fluttering open as he blinked against the brightness. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, neither of us speaking. The weight of what we'd done hung heavy between us, unspoken but undeniable. "Morning," he said finally, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I echoed, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He propped himself up on one elbow, studying me intently. "You okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Was I okay? Physically, yes. Emotionally, not so much. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "This is complicated." His expression softened, though there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "I know, and I'm sorry if I made things harder for you." "It's not just about last night," I said, sitting up and pulling the sheet tighter around me. "It's everything. Your marriage. Work. What happens next?" He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've been thinking about that too. About all of it." And I pressed, my heart pounding in anticipation. "I need to tell her," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "Sarah deserves the truth. She always has." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by dread. While I admired his resolve, I knew this wouldn't be easy for either of them. Sarah wasn't just his wife. She was a person with hopes, dreams, and feelings of her own. Breaking her heart would devastate her. And no matter how much I cared about Daniel, I couldn't ignore the pain his honesty might cause. "When are you going to do it?" I asked cautiously. "Soon," he replied, his gaze dropping to his hands. "But not today. I need time to figure out how to say it without making things worse." I nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Rushing into a conversation like this could backfire spectacularly, leaving both parties hurt and resentful. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. How long would soon take? Days? Weeks? Months? And what happened to us in the meantime? By Monday morning, the tension between us was palpable. At work, we maintained a professional distance, avoiding eye contact and keeping conversations strictly business-related. It was excruciating, knowing that the man I'd spent the weekend falling for was just a few feet away, yet completely untouchable. To make matters worse, rumors began circulating around the office. Someone had seen us leaving the same restaurant late Friday night, and suddenly, everyone seemed to have an opinion about our relationship. Whispers followed me wherever I went, their sharp edges cutting deeper with each passing day. You and Daniel, huh, my coworker Rachel teased during lunch, her tone playful but probing. Didn't realize you two were so close. We're not, I lied, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. Just working on a project together. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Right? Sure. Whatever you say. Her skepticism stung, but it was nothing compared to the knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. If people suspected something now, what would happen when Daniel finally told Sarah? Would they turn on him? On me? The thought of being ostracized, or worse, labeled as the other man, made my skin crawl. That evening, I texted Daniel, needing reassurance more than anything else. Are you okay? I typed, hitting send before I could second-guess myself. His response came a few minutes later. Not really. Can we talk? We met at a small park near his apartment, tucked away from prying eyes. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and damp earth. As I approached, I found him sitting on a bench, his head bowed and shoulders slumped. You look exhausted, I observed, taking a seat beside him. I feel exhausted, he admitted, rubbing his temples. I haven't slept since Saturday. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Sarah's? He nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah, and yours. Both of you haunting me, reminding me of what I've done. Guilt surged within me, though I knew logically that this wasn't entirely my fault. Do you regret it? No, he exclaimed, turning to face me. God, no. I don't regret being with you. But I hate that it came at such a cost. That I've hurt someone I care about deeply. His words struck a chord within me, echoing the doubts I'd been wrestling with myself. What are you going to do? I don't know, he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. I want to fix this to make things right, but I don't even know where to start. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Finally, I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Just don't shut me out, okay? He covered my hand with his, squeezing gently. I won't. I promise. Over the next week, Daniel began distancing himself. Not just from me, but from everyone. He canceled meetings, avoided social gatherings, and spent most of his time holed up in his office with the door closed. It was clear he was struggling, torn between his loyalty to Sarah and his growing feelings for me. One afternoon, I stopped by his office under the pretense of delivering a report. When I knocked, he called for me to enter, his voice weary and distant. You look like hell, I said bluntly, closing the door behind me. That he managed a weak smile, leaning back in his chair. Thanks. Always good to hear. I crossed the room, perching on the edge of his desk. Seriously, though, you can't keep doing this to yourself. You're going to burn out. I know, he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. But every time I try to think about telling Sarah, I freeze. What if she hates me? What if she never forgives me? Then you deal with it, I said firmly, though my heart ached for him. Because lying to her isn't fair. To either of you. He looked up, his eyes searching mine. And what about us? What happens if she doesn't understand? If she fights for me? The question caught me off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Deep down, I'd known this possibility existed, that Daniel might choose her over me. But hearing it aloud sent a pang of fear slicing through my chest. I don't know, I admitted softly. But I trust you to do the right thing. For everyone involved. His expression softened, gratitude mingling with sorrow. Thank you for believing in me, even when I don't believe in myself. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting the moment. He glanced at the screen, his face paling visibly. It's Sarah. My stomach dropped. Are you going to answer it? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet. I'm not ready. As he silenced the call, I felt a surge of frustration. Not at him, but at the situation. We were trapped in this limbo, unable to move forward until he faced the consequences of his actions. And until then, our future remained uncertain, dangling precariously on the edge of possibility. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed our conversation over and over in my mind. What if Sarah refused to let him go? What if Daniel decided he couldn't leave her after all? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving me restless and uneasy. But amidst the chaos, one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, I would stand by him. Because despite the risks, despite the pain, I believed in us. And maybe, just maybe, that belief would be enough to carry us through. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Daniel finally called Sarah. I didn't know he was going to do it until later that evening. When he showed up at my apartment unannounced, his face pale but resolute. He looked like a man who had been through a storm and come out the other side, exhausted, battered, but still standing. I told her, he said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice was steady, though there was a tremor beneath the surface that betrayed how much it had cost him. That I closed the door behind him, my heart pounding in anticipation. How did she take it? He sank onto the couch, running a hand over his face. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if gathering the strength to relive the conversation. Finally, he exhaled sharply and began. She cried, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. A lot. At first, she didn't believe me. She thought I was having some kind of midlife crisis, or, I don't know, making excuses because things weren't perfect between us. And then, I prompted gently, sitting beside him but keeping a respectful distance. Then she asked me if I loved you. His gaze met mine, raw and unflinching. And I told her yes. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. Hearing him say it aloud, so plainly, so honestly, felt surreal. It wasn't just confirmation of his feelings. It was a declaration of choice, of commitment, of something worth fighting for. What happens now? I asked cautiously, afraid to let myself hope too much. We're separating, he replied, his tone firm despite the sadness etched into his features. She's moving out next week. We're going to figure out the details, the house, finances, all of it, but she agreed we need time apart. Space to heal. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by guilt. While part of me was grateful that Daniel had chosen me, another part mourned the pain his decision had caused Sarah. She didn't deserve this. Not any of it. And yet, neither did we. I'm sorry. I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. For everything. He reached out, taking my hand in his. Don't be. This isn't your fault. It's mine for staying in a marriage that wasn't working long before you came along. You didn't break us, Alex. We were already broken. His words struck a chord within me, echoing the truth I'd known all along. Still, it didn't make the road ahead any less daunting. The fallout from his confession would ripple outward, affecting not just us but everyone around us. Our co-workers, our friends, our families. There would be judgment, gossip, maybe even anger. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was the man sitting beside me, holding my hand like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Over the next few weeks, life became a blur of change and adjustment. Daniel moved into a small apartment downtown, trading the sprawling suburban home he'd shared with Sarah for something simpler, quieter. Work became awkward, with whispers following us down hallways and speculative glances exchanged during meetings. Some people distanced themselves, unsure how to navigate the new dynamic. Others surprised us with their support, offering kind words or subtle gestures of solidarity. Through it all, Daniel and I leaned on each other, finding solace in the moments we could steal away together. Late-night walks under starlit skies, quiet dinners in dimly lit restaurants, conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning where we talked about everything and nothing. Each moment felt precious, fragile, like a thread weaving us closer together despite the chaos surrounding us. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he turned to me with a soft smile. Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't met? All the time, I admitted, leaning back in my chair. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier for both of us. Maybe, he conceded, his gaze thoughtful. But I don't regret it. Not for a second. Even with all the pain, all the mess. I wouldn't trade this for anything. His words filled me with a warmth that spread from my chest to the tips of my fingers and toes. In that moment, I realized how far we'd come, not just as individuals, but as partners navigating the complexities of love and identity. Daniel wasn't the same man I'd met months ago, polished and guarded, hiding behind layers of professionalism. He was someone else entirely, someone brave enough to confront his fears, vulnerable enough to embrace his truth, and strong enough to choose happiness, even when it meant risking everything. Neither was I the same person. Before Daniel, I'd spent years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that safety was better than risk, that longing was easier to bear than rejection. But he had shattered those walls, piece by piece, until all that remained was the raw, beating core of who I truly was. And while it terrified me to be so exposed, it also freed me in ways I never imagined possible. Months later, as spring gave way to summer, Daniel and I found ourselves standing on a beach at sunset, the waves lapping gently at our feet. It wasn't a grand gesture or a planned event, just a quiet moment stolen from the busyness of life. As the sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, he slipped his hand into mine, his touch warm and familiar. "You know," he said softly, his voice carrying on the breeze, "I used to think love was supposed to be easy, that if it was real, it wouldn't hurt. And now?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him. "Now I know it's the opposite," he replied, his eyes meeting mine. "Real love is messy, complicated. Sometimes it breaks you before it builds you back up again. But it's worth it, every single second." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, though I blinked them away quickly. "You sound like a poet." He laughed, the sound low and rumbling in his chest. "Nah, just a guy who finally figured out what matters." As we stood there, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. Love hadn't fixed everything. It hadn't erased the scars or silenced the doubts, but it had given us something far more valuable. The courage to face them together. In the end, that was enough.